Thanks for tuning in to Operation Revenge. Make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Now let's begin the story. I stood behind the chain link fence, watching as my family celebrated their legacy. The laughter, the pride, the handshakes, the chest thumping, none of it was for me. The Carter family homecoming was in full swing, and I was an invisible spectator, hidden behind a barrier I had no choice but to stand behind. My name is Evelyn Carter. I'm 58 years old. I've spent more than half my life in service, swearing an oath to protect and defend this country. But that oath wasn't enough for my father. 15 years ago, when I made the decision to go against orders to save those innocent children in Syria, I crossed a line that he would never forgive. It cost me everything. I could still remember the way his voice cracked when he disowned me, the way his eyes, once full of pride for his military legacy, turned cold. "You're not part of this family anymore," he'd said. "You don't belong with us." And just like that, I became a ghost to them. Today, I was nothing but a shadow at this ceremony. The only thing that remained was the sound of my boots crunching against the gravel as I kept my distance, standing on the outskirts of what was once my world. I peered through the fence, watching my brother, Travis, step up to the podium, his uniform sharp, his posture perfect. They all looked perfect, like the proud military family they were, celebrating the tradition that had been passed down through generations. But none of them knew the truth. None of them knew the real reason I had made that decision in Syria. None of them understood that I wasn't deserting them. I was saving lives. The ceremony carried on, speeches flowing from one person to the next, my father's old military buddies patting each other on the back as if they were still on active duty. My chest ached. I didn't need them to understand me. What I needed was for them to see me, to acknowledge what I had done, what I had risked. But that would never happen. To them, I had become a traitor. And in their eyes, traitors didn't get a seat at the table. But I wasn't about to walk away. I didn't need their approval anymore. I had stood up for what was right, and no amount of selective memory, no amount of celebration of their military honor could take that from me. I just stood there, still as a statue, letting the weight of the moment wash over me. As I gazed at them, the men and women I had once called family, the people I had sacrificed everything for, I made peace with my decision. It wasn't about the titles or the recognition. It was about knowing that I had saved 43 lives that night in Syria, that no matter what they said would always be my truth. But that didn't stop the ache. It never did. The silence between us was deafening, and yet I couldn't bring myself to leave. Not today. Not while they celebrated without me. I wasn't a ghost. Not today. The ceremony had reached its peak. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the neatly arranged rows of chairs. My father, still sharp as ever at 75, was in his element, holding court like a king among his loyal subjects. His voice boomed across the field, speaking about family pride, military honor, and the legacy of the Carters. The applause was endless, as if their very existence depended on it. But I was still standing behind the fence. I was an outsider now, forgotten in the very space where I had once been a central figure. The crowd continued to cheer, the noise a dull hum in the distance, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. A sudden, low rumble broke through the noise, like the growl of a thunderstorm approaching. My eyes darted toward the horizon. A line of dust appeared in the distance. It was a strange sight amidst the pristine order of the homecoming ceremony. The rumble grew louder, and soon the unmistakable sight of military Humvees came into view. 20 of them, rolling onto the field, kicking up dirt, and sending a wave of confusion through the crowd. People began to murmur, heads turning in every direction, unsure of what was happening. Was this part of the program? Was it another surprise from my father? It didn't look like it. There was something different about these vehicles. They weren't the polished trucks my father used to drive in his prime. No, these were battle-worn. The tires were caked in mud, and the insignia on the sides was unmistakable. Soldiers, no less than 200 of them, poured out of the vehicles in perfect formation. There were no cheers, no salutes, no formalities, just silence. The soldiers stood at attention, creating an impenetrable ring around the ceremony grounds. A few whispered questions began to float through the air. What is this? Who are they? Is this a joke? I knew who they were. I didn't have to ask. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I watched the last Humvee roll to a stop. The door swung open and a figure stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, and unmistakable. General Malcolm Rhodes. His uniform was impeccable, his expression grim, and the way he moved was the same as it had been 15 years ago. Calculated, deliberate, full of authority. The crowd fell quiet. This was no coincidence. General Rhodes walked toward the center of the ceremony, his boots striking the ground with the rhythm of a soldier who had seen battle, but also a soldier who had known loss. He didn't look at the crowd, didn't acknowledge the confused whispers. His eyes were locked on me, and they didn't waver as he approached the fence. There was a moment, just one, that felt like the entire world held its breath. No one spoke, no one moved. The only sound was the distant hum of engines and the quiet tension that hung between us like an unspoken agreement. I knew what was coming, and though I had been preparing myself for this, nothing could have prepared me for the gravity of the moment. As General Rhodes came to a stop just before me, he raised his hand in a sharp salute. "General Evelyn Carter," he said, his voice carrying over the silence, "I salute you for your service, your sacrifice, and your heroism." A wave of shock rippled through the crowd. The murmur of confusion turned into stunned silence. My name, my real name, was being spoken in the open for the first time in 15 years. The air felt thick with it, as if the entire world had just shifted on its axis. My heart pounded in my chest, but I didn't flinch. I didn't return the salute. I didn't need to. The truth was spoken. The truth had always been there. I had made the decision in Syria, and now, standing here, with all the ghosts of the past surrounding me, I stood firm. General Rhodes didn't move. He held the salute for just a beat longer, as though the weight of the moment needed to settle, and then, without another word, he turned and walked away. The soldiers, in perfect unison, turned and filed back into the Humvees. The convoy that had appeared as a thunderstorm quickly vanished into the same dust it had brought with it. The silence that followed was deafening. The crowd stood frozen, unsure of how to react, unsure of what had just happened. My father, still standing at the podium, didn't move. Not a word left his mouth. His face was frozen, a mask of shock and disbelief. I didn't wait for him to say anything. I didn't need his approval. I simply stepped forward, through the fence that had kept me at bay for so long. I stepped onto the military ground I had once commanded. The field that had felt like a war zone all these years finally felt like home. I was no longer the ghost. I wasn't going to let them forget me. Not anymore. The air was thick with tension. It wasn't just the shock of General Rhodes's arrival or the abrupt salute that had everyone frozen. It was the heavy silence that followed. My father, standing at the podium, was speechless, his mouth slightly agape, as if he had just witnessed something he couldn't comprehend. His eyes were locked on me, but he didn't move, didn't speak. The crowd, too, seemed unsure of what to do. They had come to celebrate the Carter family's military legacy, but now, with the truth laid bare in front of them, the very foundation of that legacy had shifted. My decision in Syria, the one I had been cast out for, was no longer a whispered secret. It was out in the open, and I wasn't going to hide behind the shadows anymore. I didn't wait for anyone to tell me what to do. I didn't need them to tell me I had a place here. I stepped forward, my boots crunching against the gravel, and made my way toward the empty space at the front of the ceremony. Every step felt like I was walking away from the years of silence, from the years of erasure. I wasn't just walking toward the crowd, I was walking toward the truth. Behind me, I could hear the murmurs starting to swell, slowly building into something more, something louder, but I kept moving forward. When I reached the center of the ceremony grounds, I stopped. I didn't look at my father. I didn't look at anyone else. I simply stood there, breathing in the cool air. It felt like everything was suspended in time. The weight of 15 years, the silence, the erasure, the judgment, seemed to lift just for a moment. Then, General Rhodes's voice cut through the stillness. "It's time," he said, his voice steady, yet carrying an undeniable authority. He stepped forward again, this time standing beside me. "The truth is out now," he continued, looking toward the crowd that was still processing what had just happened. General Evelyn Carter saved lives in Syria. She made a decision that not only put her career on the line but saved 43 children's lives. Those children will never be forgotten, and neither will she. The silence was absolute. My father, still frozen at the podium, hadn't moved an inch. His hands gripped the sides of the lectern so tightly that his knuckles were white. He didn't know what to do with himself. My brother Travis stood beside him, his face a mix of confusion and uncertainty. I could feel their eyes on me, but I refused to turn around. I didn't need their validation anymore. General Rhodes turned to me, his expression softening for the first time. He gave me a slight nod. "You deserve this, Evelyn," he said quietly, loud enough for only me to hear. You've earned it. I couldn't speak. The lump in my throat was too big, the emotions too overwhelming. So I just nodded back. I wasn't sure I was ready to hear the things I needed to hear, not from them, not from my father. But then, a voice broke through the quiet, as if it had been waiting for this very moment. Well, that's a fine story, isn't it? My father's voice, cold and sharp, finally cut through the heavy silence. A fine story for all these people to hear. But it's not the whole truth, is it, Evelyn? His words struck me like a slap. I turned slowly, finally meeting his gaze. He was standing tall at the podium, his face twisted in a mixture of anger and disbelief. The years of resentment, of everything he had never said, were finally spilling out. You think this makes you a hero? He spat. You think because one man decides to validate your actions that suddenly you're the hero of this family? I stood there, feeling the weight of his words, but I didn't back down. I wasn't going to cower in front of him anymore. I don't need to be your hero, I said quietly but firmly. I don't need you to validate me. I didn't do it for you or for this family. I did it because it was the right thing to do. His face reddened, his fists tightening at his sides. The right thing? You broke everything we built. You broke this family's name, and for what? Some foreign children who will never know who you are? You're no hero, Evelyn. You're just a deserter. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. I could feel their eyes on us, but I didn't care. Not anymore. This wasn't about them. It was about me and him. It was always about him and me. I didn't desert anyone, I said, my voice low but clear. I didn't abandon this family. I saved lives. The lives of children who needed me. That's not desertion. That's bravery. Bravery? He repeated, as if the word itself tasted foul in his mouth. You're a disgrace. You'll never understand what it means to be a Carter. You're not part of this legacy anymore. I heard the subtle gasp of the crowd behind me. It was a familiar reaction, the kind of gasp I had heard so many times in the past when my father had finally pushed too far. Maybe I'm not part of the Carter legacy, I said, my voice steady, but I'm part of a legacy that matters, and that's something you'll never understand. My father didn't reply. Instead, he turned his back on me, striding off the stage with Travis following close behind him. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of my own breath in the air. The weight of everything we had just said hung between us. And then, in the midst of the silence, I felt something shift. The years of anger, of betrayal, of being erased began to loosen their grip on my chest. I no longer needed their approval. I had always been part of a different legacy, one that would never fade, no matter how many times they tried to erase me. I stepped forward, my head held high, no longer burdened by their judgment. The truth was mine, and for the first time in 15 years, I felt free. The days following the homecoming ceremony were a blur. My father's words echoed in my mind, sharper than the stares of everyone at that ceremony. You'll never understand what it means to be a Carter. Those words hurt, but they didn't break me. I had long stopped looking for his approval, yet the silence that followed still stung. The silence from my family had always been a form of emotional warfare, an erasure, a ghosting that wasn't just physical, but psychological. My existence, my sacrifices, had been swept under the rug for so long that, in their eyes, I was no longer even worth a memory. I didn't need their recognition, but I wasn't going to pretend the hurt didn't sit like a stone in my chest. And that's when the flashbacks started to come. I sat alone at the kitchen table one night, my coffee cooling in the cup beside me, the harsh light of the overhead fixture illuminating nothing but shadows. I hadn't seen my family in months, hadn't heard from them since the ceremony. My phone had gone silent, no texts, no calls. They had written me out as they always had. But now, it felt like I was living in some painful purgatory, caught between who I had been and the woman I had fought to become. It wasn't always like this, not when I first joined the military. Back then, I was just Evelyn Carter, a proud daughter of a decorated soldier, ready to take on the world. The Carter family had always celebrated their military ties, and I had been no exception, just a younger version of the same thing. But that was before Syria. That was before my decision to go against my orders. Back then, I could still hear my father's praise, feel the pride in his voice when he talked about me, when he spoke of my future in uniform. I was the next in line, the next Carter to make history, to uphold the family name. But that was before I became the person who made a decision they didn't like. And the moment I did, everything changed. I thought about the dinner that night, that last family meal before Syria. I had been sitting at the end of the table, as I usually did. My father had been there, strong, commanding as always. My brother Travis had been on his best behavior, as usual, and me? I was just trying to fit in. But the conversation had turned, as it always did, to military matters. My father had been speaking about some mission, a high-profile one, and his voice had been thick with pride. But as soon as I mentioned my orders in Syria, the choice I had made to go off-script and save those children, his face had hardened. "Evelyn," he had said, his tone dropping to something colder than I had ever heard from him. "What you did, it's not something a Carter would do." I had tried to explain. I had tried to make him understand. But his eyes had glazed over with disappointment, and the words he had spoken next were like a stone falling into a well, a sound that echoed for years. "You're not part of this family anymore," he'd said. "You've lost your place at this table." That moment had torn through me in ways I couldn't understand at the time. I hadn't been prepared for it, hadn't been ready for my father to strip me of everything I had worked for. But there it was, the end of the person I had once been to them. That night, they had moved on without me. My photograph had been removed from the mantle. My name had been wiped from the family history. And I had been made to feel like I no longer belonged, like I was nothing but an imposter in my own family. And yet, I had stayed. I had stayed and endured the loneliness, the subtle exclusion. I stayed because there was a part of me that still believed I could make them see, make them understand. The last family dinner was the worst. It had been a simple thing, a casual gathering like any other. But I had felt the absence, the coldness in the air. My father had barely looked at me. Travis had kept his distance. My mother, too, had been polite, but there was a subtle edge to her words. I had sat at the end of the table again, like a ghost. My seat had felt more like a sentence than a place at the table. I had spoken when spoken to, but I had stayed quiet when the conversation turned to things I no longer had a place in. They had treated me like a shadow, a distant memory of the family they once knew. I hadn't been the daughter they had once been proud of. I had been something else, something that didn't belong. That night, I had been made invisible, and I had never protested. I had never tried to fight them on it. I kept my head down, kept quiet, but that wasn't the only moment that had burned into me. There had been 1,000 other moments, each one small, subtle, but cutting just the same. They had erased me in ways that were invisible to everyone else, but I felt every single one of them. I closed my eyes, the weight of the memories pressing against me. The photo albums were gone. The family gatherings were held without me. I was excluded, removed, written off, and for all that silence, I had done nothing to stop it. But I wasn't going to sit in this silence anymore. The decision I made in Syria, the one that had cost me my place in this family, had been the hardest choice I ever made. But in the end, it had been the right one. I had saved those children, and that would always be the truth, even if they tried to erase it. As the years passed, I had internalized their rejection. I had accepted it as a part of my reality. I had learned to move forward, not because they had forgiven me, but because I didn't need their forgiveness anymore. But the pain of being erased was something I couldn't let go of. Not yet, and maybe I never would. I looked out the window at the empty land in front of me, the sun setting behind the horizon, the quiet farm I had come to love, the place where I had started over. This was my home now. No more empty chairs, no more quiet dinners, no more silencing my truth for their comfort. I didn't need them to understand me anymore. I just needed to stand tall in the life I had built, the one I had chosen for myself. And maybe, just maybe, the silence would be enough to heal the wounds that had been left behind. It had been a few weeks since the homecoming ceremony, since the day General Rhodes had publicly saluted me, restoring a piece of my military honor that had been buried for 15 years. The weight of it still felt heavy, but in a different way. It was like a key turning in a lock I didn't even know I had. But it hadn't fixed anything. My family still hadn't reached out. There had been no apology, no attempt to understand. The silence between us was suffocating. I wasn't expecting things to be fixed overnight, but I had hoped for something, even if just a crack in their indifference. One morning, while I was tending to the fence in the pasture, my phone buzzed in my pocket. The number was unfamiliar, but I didn't hesitate. I wiped my hands on my jeans and answered it. "Evelyn, it's Allison," came the voice on the other end. She was my cousin, a distant relative who had always been a bit more empathetic than the rest of the family. She was the kind of person who could see the gray in situations when everyone else saw black and white. "Hey, Allison," I said, leaning against the fence as I looked out over the land. "How's everything?" "I wish I was calling under better circumstances," she said, her voice tight with concern. "Listen, I don't know if you've heard, but there's a big family ceremony coming up. A formal one for the Carters. It's a celebration of the family legacy. They're inviting everyone except you. I felt a lump form in my throat, but I didn't let it show. I figured as much. They wouldn't want me there, not after what happened. Right, Allison said, a note of bitterness creeping into her tone. But that's not the worst of it. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. What's going on, Allison? Evelyn, I'm not sure if you've seen the message that went around the family, but your father has arranged for a reconciliation ceremony. It's all staged. They're going to pretend like nothing happened, like you've just been, well, forgotten, but they're hoping to gloss over everything, make it all look fine. A bitter laugh escaped me. They think they can do that? Just make me disappear and have everything go back to normal? Allison sighed. I'm sorry, but I know them. They're going to pretend they've moved on. They're going to make it look like you're the one who abandoned them. The words hit harder than I expected. I had known that they would never admit to their own wrongs, but to hear it laid out so plainly was another gut punch. For all the years I'd given them, for all the sacrifices I had made, it was still never enough. To them, I was the one at fault. I've been thinking about this for a while, Allison continued. I know it's not fair. And I know you don't need their approval, but I think it's time someone stood up. You deserve to have your story told. You deserve to be recognized for what you did, not just for the military, but for yourself. I stood silently for a moment, my mind racing. What are you saying? All I'm asking is this, she said, her voice firm but gentle. The Department of Defense declassified your mission, the one you did in Syria. You had to submit a request for that, didn't you? Yes, I replied quietly, but it wasn't a simple request. It's something that could only be seen for a short time. I've asked them to release a small portion of it, just enough for them to know the truth. All you need is for them to see it, Allison said. I know they've closed the door on you, but you don't have to let them forget. You can get the records released, and, for at least a short time, they'll know what you did, the real story. You don't have to hide anymore, Evelyn. Not from them, not from anyone. The weight of her words settled on me like a lead blanket. I had buried the truth for so long, buried it under years of silence, under their rejection. But now I had the opportunity to let it rise to the surface, to let them know what I had really done, even if only for a moment. I hadn't considered the possibility of revealing the truth through official channels. I had always assumed they would ignore it, just like they had ignored me, but maybe this was the chance to have them confront what they had tried to erase. My hands clenched into fists as I made my decision. Okay, I said, my voice low but resolute. I'll make the request. A limited window. Just enough for them to see what I did. Just enough for them to see me for who I am, for who I've always been. Allison's voice softened. You don't need them to see you, Evelyn. You know who you are. Maybe, I said, the uncertainty creeping back into my voice. But they need to know the truth about me. I ended the call with a deep breath, the weight of the decision sitting heavily in my chest. I had already sacrificed so much, my reputation, my family, my place in the world. Now, I was finally going to take back what they had stolen from me. I would force them to confront the truth of what I had done. The decision was final. The truth would come out, even if only for a short time. And when it did, it would shake their foundation to its core. I pulled out my phone and composed the request, setting a strict time frame, 45 minutes of visibility. That was all I would need to ensure they couldn't ignore me any longer. I pressed send. The ball was in motion now. There was no turning back. The evening before the ceremony, I arrived at the venue quietly, blending into the crowd like a shadow. My feet crunched softly against the gravel as I walked past the grand entrance, where family members and long-lost relatives were gathering for the event. The air felt heavier than it should have, thick with the weight of unspoken words and histories that had been buried for far too long. The Carter family had made a spectacle of their military legacy, and tonight was no different. But I wasn't here to bask in it. I wasn't here to make an appearance and be swept into their world of hollow pride. I was here for something more. I stood off to the side behind a low wooden fence that bordered the venue. It wasn't a place for attention. It wasn't where I was supposed to be, not anymore. But it was where I needed to be. The evening was alive with chatter, with the sound of glasses clinking and laughter rising from the tables. My father, standing tall as ever, was greeting old friends, shaking hands with people I barely recognized. The same parade of faces, the faces of those who had never bothered to reach out to me, those who had erased me from their history. I had been relegated to this quiet corner, and I wasn't sure if it was by their design or my own choice. But then, the unmistakable sound of engines reached my ears. A distant rumble, steady and deliberate, broke through the hum of the evening. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but it grew louder. My heart quickened, a sudden recognition sparking within me. The Humvees rolled onto the property just like they had at the homecoming ceremony, 20 vehicles in perfect formation. A hush fell over the crowd as people turned, heads snapping in confusion, curiosity, and concern. This wasn't part of the program. This wasn't normal. I stood still, watching as the convoy of military vehicles slowly made its way toward the venue. My hands gripped the fence, the familiar sensation of adrenaline coursing through me. I had asked for this, but it still felt like a shock. The vehicles stopped in a neat line, their engines cutting off with a single collective hum. A tense silence settled over the crowd. I could feel it. A collective uncertainty, like a wave ready to crash, but no one knew when. General Rhodes stepped out of the last Humvee, his posture perfect, his expression unreadable. The man who had once been my superior, the man who had always known the weight of my decision, the man who had kept his distance for so long, now walked toward me with purpose. The soldiers around him moved with practiced precision, standing in perfect formation, their eyes fixed forward, their presence commanding. It was as if they had all stepped out of a different time, a different reality, one that I hadn't been part of for far too long. The crowd stood frozen, unsure of what was happening, unsure of what to do with the sudden display of military authority. But I didn't move. I didn't need to. This was my moment. It wasn't about the ceremony, it wasn't about the crowd, it was about the truth finally being seen. General Rhodes walked toward the front of the venue, his eyes never leaving mine. When he reached me, he stopped, standing just a few feet away. The silence hung in the air, heavy and palpable like the world had stopped turning just to witness this moment. The general's gaze shifted from me to the crowd, a subtle acknowledgement of the history we were about to rewrite. Then, without any fanfare, he raised his hand in a sharp salute. "General Evelyn Carter," he said, his voice ringing through the quiet, "I salute you for your service, your sacrifice, and the lives you saved." The words carried across the yard, louder than the engines, more powerful than the whispers that had followed me for years. The crowd was still, their faces frozen, some in confusion, some in disbelief. But the truth had been spoken. For the first time in years, the silence was no longer mine to carry alone. I stood firm, the weight of his salute settling into my bones. I didn't return the salute. I didn't need to. The truth stood between us now, unbroken, undeniable. It had been spoken, and it couldn't be erased. The general held the salute for just a beat longer, then lowered his arm. Without a word, he turned and began to walk away, the soldiers following in perfect formation. The Humvees revved their engines once more, the sound shaking the air before they drove off, disappearing into the distance as quickly as they had arrived. The crowd remained frozen, unsure of what had just happened. They looked at me, looked at the space I now occupied, but no one approached. Not yet. Not until they had figured out what to make of this moment. I felt the weight of the past 15 years lifting. Just a little. Just enough to remind me that I had not been forgotten. My family could pretend I didn't exist, but they couldn't erase the truth. I stepped forward, away from the fence, and into the space where I had once belonged. And this time, no one could stop me. The ceremony had taken a sharp turn. What was meant to be a celebration of military tradition, a display of the Carter family legacy, had turned into something entirely different. My father, still standing at the podium, looked as if the ground had shifted beneath him. His hands, clenched tight around the lectern, betrayed the struggle inside him. He wasn't ready for the truth, and neither was anyone else. The crowd had settled into a stunned silence. Whispers floated through the air like ghosts. Some people still weren't sure what had just happened. Some were too proud to admit they were shocked by what had unfolded before them. But me? I wasn't going to wait for them to catch up. The truth had been laid out for all to see, and now I was going to make sure they heard it, loud and clear. For the first time in 15 years, I didn't feel invisible. The weight of the past, of the erasure, had been lifted. Just a little. The weight of being forgotten by the people who once called me daughter, sister, soldier, gone. I stood at the front of that crowd, standing firm in my truth. No longer cast aside, no longer a ghost. Then, through the silence, came the voice I'd been waiting for. From the back of the crowd, a young man stepped forward. He was no older than 20, his movements hesitant but purposeful. His face was familiar, though it took me a moment to place him. His eyes met mine, and there was a recognition, an understanding in them that made my breath catch. It was one of the children I had saved. The one who had escaped the bombing, the one who had held on long enough for me to pull him to safety. His name was Asim, though I hadn't heard it in years. He stepped toward me, his footsteps unsteady, as if the weight of the moment was just beginning to settle on him too. The crowd parted for him, and as he approached, he stopped just a few feet away, his eyes searching my face. And then, without warning, he dropped to one knee. His actions were deliberate, measured, and in that single moment, everything fell into place. "I owe my life to you," Asim said, his voice strong, though a tremor ran through it. "You saved me. You saved my sister, my family. You saved us all." The words hung in the air like a confession, like a prayer that no one had dared to speak before. For the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't in so long: acknowledgement. Real acknowledgement. Asim continued, his words carrying over the quiet. "You may not have been recognized by your family, by the people you loved, but I recognize you. We all do." He stood then, his eyes never leaving mine. He reached out a hand, offering it to me, and in his eyes I saw not just gratitude, but the weight of the truth that had been buried for far too long. The truth about my actions, about the lives I had saved, about the choices that no one had ever been willing to see. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything." I stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to say. The truth he spoke was not just mine. It was the truth of those I had saved, the truth of a mission that had never been told. And now, here it was, out in the open. No more silencing, no more erasure. Just the truth, plain and clear. I took his hand, the weight of his gratitude filling me with a strength I hadn't known I'd lost. "I didn't do it alone," I said quietly, my voice thick with emotion. "We all fought for it. I just had to make the choice. And you all survived because you were strong enough to hold on." The crowd, still in shock, began to stir. Conversations started quietly at first, murmurs that were hard to make out. But something had shifted. Something had changed in the air. They weren't just looking at me anymore. They were seeing me, finally. My father, still standing at the podium, was motionless. He hadn't said a word since the general's salute. His silence spoke volumes. He wasn't ready to accept the truth, not yet. Maybe he never would. But Asim had spoken for me. He had said what no one in my family had ever dared to say. And that, for me, was enough. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the need for anyone's approval. I didn't need my father's pride. I didn't need my brother's validation. I didn't need anyone to tell me I had done the right thing. I had already known. The crowd's whispers began to quiet down as the realization started to settle. The truth had been laid out, and they couldn't deny it anymore. And in that moment, I wasn't just a soldier. I wasn't just a woman standing in the shadows. I was someone who had made a difference, and no one could take that from me. The ceremony continued, but it felt different now. I didn't need to stand in front of them to prove anything. They had seen me. They had heard the truth. And maybe, just maybe, it would be enough for them to start seeing me as I truly was. Asim stepped back into the crowd, his face still alight with the truth he had just spoken. I watched him go, his shoulders squared with the weight of something real and unbroken. The silence in the air wasn't just mine to carry anymore, and for the first time in years, I felt free. The drive back to my farm was quiet, the hum of the engine filling the space as the weight of the ceremony began to settle over me. I wasn't sure what to feel. There had been so much in that moment. Asim's acknowledgement, the weight of my father's silence, the uncomfortable reality of seeing the family I once belonged to without the veil of illusion I had carried for so long. I parked my truck by the barn and stepped out, inhaling the crisp air of the farm that had become my sanctuary. It was quiet here, the sounds of nature offering a peace I hadn't realized I needed. The gentle rustling of leaves, the low hum of the wind in the trees, it felt like home. This was where I had rebuilt myself, where I had learned to exist without the approval of others, where I had found the strength to move forward, even when everything else was falling apart. I walked toward the porch, the familiar creak of the old wood beneath my boots grounding me in the moment. The sun was dipping low on the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. I hadn't felt peace like this in years. As I reached the porch, I noticed the letter sitting on the table, the envelope unmistakable. The handwriting was familiar, though not something I had expected to see again. It was from my father. I stared at it for a moment, the familiar feeling of anger and hurt rising inside me. I had spent so many years waiting for him to reach out, hoping for an apology, for some sign of reconciliation. But now, standing on my own porch, having stood up to him in front of the family, I wasn't sure if I wanted to open it, but I couldn't leave it untouched. I picked it up and tore the envelope open, pulling out the single sheet of paper inside. My heart beat a little faster as I read the first line. Evelyn, I'm not sure where to begin. I exhaled sharply and continued reading, my mind racing. I've spent the last few days thinking about everything. About you, about the choices you made, the choice I didn't understand, and the choice that made me cut you off. I was wrong. I see that now. I paused, the weight of the words hitting me hard. Was this really happening? Was my father admitting that he had been wrong? I don't expect forgiveness, not yet, but I do owe you this. I understand now that your actions were not out of rebellion, but out of conviction. You did what you had to do, and in doing so, you saved lives. I can't erase the past, and I can't undo the hurt I caused. But I hope this letter is a start. My hand shook as I continued reading, the words blurring in front of my eyes. I can't promise everything will be as it once was, but I want to try. If you're willing, I'd like to come by. Maybe we can talk. For the first time in 15 years, I'm asking if you'll let me. Your father, George. The letter dropped from my hands, the paper fluttering in the breeze. I stood there stunned for a moment that felt like an eternity. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't everything I had wanted or needed from him, but it was something. It was a crack in the wall he had built around himself and around me. I wasn't sure if I could trust him again. I wasn't sure if I was ready for whatever conversation he wanted to have. But something in me, something I hadn't felt in years, told me that maybe, just maybe, this could be the beginning of something different. I sat down on the porch swing, the weight of the letter still in my hands. I didn't need my father's approval. I didn't need anyone's approval, but I had spent so many years holding on to the hope that someday things might change. And maybe, just maybe, this was that day. The night stretched out before me, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had a choice. I could let the silence between us remain, or I could take the next step, whatever it might be. I didn't have all the answers, but I had something I hadn't had in years. Hope. Maybe it was a fool's hope, or maybe it was something more. But either way, I wasn't running from it. I took a deep breath and stared out at the horizon. The silence of the farm wrapped around me like a blanket, but it didn't feel oppressive anymore. It felt like the calm before something new, something I hadn't expected, but something I could handle. I wasn't alone anymore. Not really. I stood up walking toward the barn. Tomorrow I would deal with it. Tomorrow I would decide what to do. But tonight I would let the silence be my peace. For the first time in years, it didn't feel like an enemy. It felt like the space I needed to breathe, to be. And for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to feel the weight of possibility. The days that followed were quieter than I had expected. Despite the weight of my father's letter, I hadn't acted on it right away. Something in me hesitated, unsure if I was ready to take the next step. The old patterns, the hurt, the distance, they still lingered like ghosts in the corners of my mind. But the uncertainty that had clouded my life for so many years had started to shift. I spent my days doing what I knew best, working the farm, fixing fences, caring for the animals. The physical labor helped to clear my mind, to keep me grounded in the present. But I couldn't escape the thoughts that lingered whenever I had a quiet moment to myself. I hadn't heard from my father since the letter. No phone call, no visits. Part of me had expected him to show up right away, to rush over and try to fix everything, to make amends in the only way he knew how. But he didn't. And in a strange way, I found peace in that. Maybe it was because he hadn't shown up that I realized this was my decision. The phone buzzed in my pocket, pulling me from my thoughts. I pulled it out, the screen flashing with an unknown number. My heart skipped a beat, but I didn't let myself hesitate. I answered before the second ring. Evelyn? It was my father's voice. My throat tightened, and for a moment, I wasn't sure what to say. Yes, Dad, I finally said, my voice steady. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. It was as if he, too, was choosing his words carefully. I don't expect this to be easy, he said, his voice quieter than usual. I know I've hurt you, and I can't undo that. But I'm asking for a chance to talk. I could hear the weight of his words, the raw honesty that had never been there before. This wasn't about power or control. This was an admission of regret, an acknowledgement of the gulf that had formed between us. I'm listening, I said, feeling the knot in my chest loosen, just a little. I don't know what I was thinking all those years ago. I let my pride and my fear blind me to what you were doing, to what you sacrificed. I made a choice to shut you out, to erase you from my life, and I'm sorry for that. I don't expect you to forgive me right now, but I need you to know that I see you. I see what you did, and I understand it now. My heart skipped a beat at his words, and I felt a strange sense of release, like a dam had broken inside me. It wasn't everything I had wanted. It wasn't some grand reconciliation, but it was enough. Enough to start again. You don't have to fix everything, Dad, I said, my voice softer than I intended. But maybe we can start by not pretending like I don't exist. I'm not the same person I was 15 years ago. I've changed, and so have you. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and I could almost hear him processing my words. Finally, he spoke again, his voice more certain this time. You're right. We've both changed, and I don't know where this will go, but I'm willing to find out, if you are. I closed my eyes, letting his words wash over me. For the first time, there was hope. Real, tangible hope. Not for some idealized reunion, but for something real, a new beginning, a new way forward. I'm willing, I said, my voice steady. I'll listen, Dad. That's all I can promise right now. I understand, he said quietly. I'm not asking for more than that. The call ended with a quiet click, and for a moment I stood there, holding the phone in my hand, feeling the weight of the conversation. It wasn't the closure I had hoped for, nor the full reconciliation I had once dreamed of, but it was something. It was a crack in the wall. The days after that were a blur of new beginnings. My father didn't show up immediately, and I didn't expect him to, but his message had been clear, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel the need to chase after him or force him to accept me. I was okay. I was enough, even without their validation. The truth had been spoken, and that had always been enough. And if they couldn't see it, I wasn't going to let that define me anymore. A few weeks later, as I was finishing a late evening on the farm, I saw headlights coming down the long dirt road. My heart quickened in my chest, and I didn't know whether to feel nervous or calm. But I didn't run. I didn't retreat. I stood still, waiting for whatever came next. The truck pulled up, and I saw my father step out, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his gait slower than I remembered. He hesitated when he saw me standing there, but he didn't shy away. His face was older, more lined than I remembered, but there was something softer in his eyes, a vulnerability I hadn't seen in years. I didn't know where to start, he said, his voice gruff. Start by saying what you came here to say, I replied, the space between us suddenly not so vast. He nodded, taking a step forward. I'm sorry, Evelyn. I should have been there for you when you needed me. I should have been a better father. And with that, we stood there, neither of us needing to say more. We didn't need grand gestures. What we needed was the acknowledgement that we had both been wrong, that we had both been lost in our own ways, but now maybe we could find our way back to each other. The silence between us was no longer something to fear. It was a space where, for the first time, we both allowed ourselves to heal. I didn't need to hear the words, I forgive you. I didn't need him to fix everything. All I needed was for him to see me for who I had become, to recognize that the woman standing before him was strong, independent, and whole. And in that quiet moment, I knew we were on the path to something different, something real. The past was behind us, the future, uncertain, but it was ours to shape.